Hi everybody. So far, we've been talking about components both directly as well as indirectly through some of the examples we've been looking at. Now, what we've been covering about components has been very high level. We learned the basics, just enough to get our feet wet to become more comfortable with using them. Well, in this video, we're going to get really comfortable using them. We're going to apply components to more realistic scenarios. So here's the thing. So far, what we've been doing has been kind of on the trivial side of what you might be doing in the real world. You won't often get a chance to display your name on the screen, display a list of superheroes and famous people, or even display a set of colored blocks that have a vowel inside of them. I mean, how often in the real world do you get to do this? Now, if you're really lucky, hopefully the answer is all the time. But realistically though, you're never going to be doing some of these things. And while it's good to get a basic idea of how React does stuff, it isn't really great to try to apply React to more realistic situations. So what we're going to do in this example is create something a little bit more involved. We're going to create what is a digital version of a color palette card. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with color palette cards, but if you go to any paint store or hardware store, you'll see rows of these to help you match a color with a particular thing you're trying to match it with. And it looks kind of like this. It's a rectangular shaped item. A large chunk of it is devoted to a color you're representing, and then below you have a label. In this case, I have a hex value. You might even have something that is written in English or the name of a paint brand that matches the color you're trying to find. It doesn't matter. It's a card. If you have designer friends, they probably have walls of them just as a way of just feeling comfortable. So, what we're going to do is this. We're going to recreate all of that in React. Now, to recreate UI in React, the way you do this is, that's actually pretty systematic. There are there are two steps you should always follow. One step is this. First, identify the major visual elements. And the second step is to figure out what the components will be. Now, these two seem very simple, but like many things of this sort, it's going to be more art than science, but the more you end up using and practicing these steps, the better you will be at identifying which and where to draw the line. And we're going to walk through an example of this right now. So at the very high level, our palette card, we could start with saying a component could be the entire card by itself. That's definitely one start. So we have our entire component wrapped up. Now the thing is, a component by itself isn't probably the best way of defining everything, especially in our application. And the general guidance is this. If you want a component should not do too many things. It should at most do just a single thing. And right now, our component isn't really doing a single thing. It's doing everything short of, it's showing a color, it's showing the label, and it's also being the container for both of those pieces to actually make up the card piece. So we can go a little bit further. Now, we can break our component down into two more pieces. We have one component just for the color, then we have one component just for the label. And that's not too bad. I think we're getting somewhat close to dividing up our visual into smaller composable pieces. Now we can go even further. Our label component doesn't have to be just the label and the background region. We could separate out the background region and the label one more time. Now at this point, it doesn't seem like we can go any further, right? All the major visual elements have been identified and also decomposed. But there's a challenge that comes into defining components. What you don't want to do is have too few components, which is where we started off with, but you also don't want to have an overload of components, which is on the other end of where we just ended up. The right place is to be somewhere in the middle, and this is where it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's a little bit more of an art than a science, but the general guidance of you don't want a component to do too many things always holds, and use that as your North Star in figuring out where to go. So when it comes to breaking our components from earlier, I think it's good to actually start with our big card and then separate out the color from it. Those would be two of our components, and I think that's fine. I think we can totally be happy with that particular arrangement. Now, what do we do with the label? Do we go all the way out and divide our label into two more components, or do we just stick with the component as is? Now, our label can be more simple. We can actually choose to have the parent component, the big card picture up there, actually handle taking care of the rectangular region. We can just have the text be its own component as well. So you have a lot of leeway, a lot of wiggle room in being able to draw the line where you want to have your visual elements mapped to various components. That makes sense, right? Well, I hope it does. And now we're going to get to the fun part. It's time to build this example, and this example is going to be made up of a fair amount of code, but that's a good thing because that's really how you'll be using React in the real world. So with that, let's go to our favorite code editor. Okay, my favorite code editor, as you all know, is Atom, but you can use whatever code editor that you want. Just make sure that you have a starting point that matches what we've been doing so far, which is just a blank HTML page with nothing really extra going on. So for example, we have a style element, we have a body style rule, which we just zoom the content by 200%, like I mentioned here. Don't add it just for the video. The more interesting thing is this. We have an HTML element, a div element, an ID value of container, and then we have our script where we have the starting point for application, which is we're just having a destination variable that gets a pointer to the DOM element with ID values container. And then we have a React DOM, that render method, which doesn't do anything fancy. It just outputs two div elements, and then it outputs to a location of destination, which is this div element right here. So we are in a starting point that you've seen many times already. It's pretty familiar. And what we're going to do now is start by defining the various components that will make up our card palette. So the three components we've identified really are, first, it is our card. The second is the label. And the third is the square, the colored region that ends up making up what you see. So let's go and start with the card. Var card equals react.create class. And just like before, we're going to go ahead and define the object that goes inside of it. And as all components need to do, they need to have a render method that is a function. And inside of it, it'll be a return statement where they will basically output some JSX. So all of this pretty much unchanged and everything is good. And then make sure that the parentheses and the brackets all match. They do. And this is one of the things I always end up messing up. So I like to double check that. So we have our card component. Don't worry, it doesn't really do anything yet. It's okay. We'll start with the card component first. Now let's go ahead and add our label component. I'm going to copy the card component. I'll just rename the text from rename the name of our component from card to label. You know, who wants to type all that in? And let's go ahead and create the square component. This is what I'm calling the region that we're actually coloring into a different color. Okay, so right now we have our square component, label component, and card component. And as expected, they don't really do much. So if you look at the live preview, in my case, there's nothing getting displayed, which is totally expected, which is par for the course. So now let's go ahead and fill out the card component. So the card component is essentially a container. It is what houses what we're going to make, what we are eventually going to be calling the palette card. So what we're going to do first is just define the structure of this element. So let me go ahead and return a div element, div/div. That's always a good starting point. And how you start, what your starting elements are will always vary, but you can never go wrong with using div elements, at least as you're starting to get some stuff figured out. So what I'm going to do next is define the look and feel of this card, because this card is just going to be a container. It isn't really going to have a whole lot of content of its own. The magic is really going to be in the styling that goes into it. So I'm going to do var card style. And I'm going to style this using the React-based approach, not the CSS approach. And that's, I'm going to jump between both of those approaches as we see in future videos. So I just want to be familiar with both of them so that you can pick and choose the right approach for whatever, it suits your needs. So card style, let's set the height of this to, if I can spell it correctly, height to 200 pixels. Let's go ahead and set the width to 150 pixels. And that kind of creates the approximate box for it. We'll get a padding value of 0. And background color, my favorite of all the properties always, it's going to be white. So nothing too exciting there. And now we want to give our card a little background color, a drop shadow. We saw in our example earlier that the card has like a nice shadow. If you go back to our example, you can kind of see it here. See, there's a slight subtle drop shadow going on. What we want to do is kind of recreate that in markup. So let's go back to Atom. And here I'm going to specify the shadow in the terms of filter. And now the filter property is somewhat widely supported, but not fully. You might still need to use the vendor prefixed version of it. So here's another interesting React tidbit on how we deal with something that is different between what you do in JavaScript and what we might do in the real world. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify the filter, and we're going to first specify the filter in its unprefixed state. So filter drop shadow, and I think it's 0 pixels, 5 pixels, hashtag 666. I think what this means is that our drop shadow is going to start square at the top left corner of our shape. It's going to be spreading out by 5 pixels, and the shadow color will be a somewhat darkish gray. All right, so we have our filter property specified, but what because of vendor prefixing, the filter property needs to also have a prefix. So in this case, I'm going to just specify the WebKit filter. So notice that the WebKit is actually capitalized. It's not camel case like you normally would see. Vendor prefix properties are start off capitalized, and the individual words that make up the dashed version of our property are also capitalized. So both the W in WebKit and the F in filter are capitalized. Crazy, right? Drop shadow. And I'm actually just going to copy this value straight up, actually. What am I doing here? Writing it all over again. We're not animals. All right. So now we have our card style. We specified about 6 properties that define the size, no padding, the background color, and a nice drop shadow to kind of recreate the effect that we are trying to go with. And so all we need to do is make sure that we apply the style to our element. And that means we go to our div element that our component returns, and give it the style attribute and specify card style as the style object to use for all its styling. So we've defined our card component at least up until this point, and all we need to do is make sure our card component is actually used in our application. And that means we have to make sure it is called from our React DOM render method. And that's going to be pretty easy because our card component doesn't really have too much going on for it. It's just a single element. We're going to specify card and hit save. Now, if everything worked out properly, you should see a card getting displayed on the screen. And for whatever reason, that is not happening, which is a great chance for us to test out our debugging abilities. So what I'm going to do is bring up our example, not in Atom, but in Chrome. So here I have the application. It's the same exact code that we are seeing running in Atom right now. And as expected, nothing is currently showing up. So to help figure out what's going on, let's bring up the DevTools. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the DevTools by inspecting anywhere on the page. And notice what you can see. Well, you can't see anything much right now. Let me zoom in a bit. And notice what you see right here. Our HTML is being generated. You can see div react root. You can see our element is actually being displayed on screen. It's just not showing up in the drop shadow. We'll figure that out next. And let's see if there's any errors in their page as well. So when I look up right here, you can see there's some errors. And so far so good. Actually, everything seems to be fine except for, oh, here's an error. Inline Babel script unexpected token. And it's pointing to these return statements where something seems to be happening. It's not this one. Our div style currently has a value on it. It could probably be the items right here, label and square. And here's the reason. We can't have a return statement that doesn't really do anything. So chalk that up to another one of React's quirks they must be aware of. So while we're not going to do anything much with it right now, let's return an empty dev element. Nothing exciting going on. So I'm just going to do angle bracket div, close bracket. That's it. So that's all we're going to our div statement. Now let's refresh the page to make sure that gets rid of the error. So I'm going to refresh, and a few moments later, okay, no error, which is good. So that's really what the warnings were. But one of the things you should have noticed when you saw the error was how detailed and verbose it was. One of the things I absolutely love about React is that its errors are not plain. They don't leave you hanging out in the cold. They actually go as detailed as possible to make sure that you know exactly what is wrong. And they use English, not just random numbers and characters, but actual English to kind of help you point in the right direction so that you can help fix what's going on. All right, so we now have our div element, and nothing's going to happen here when we return them, but that's okay, it gets rid of the errors. Now let's go back and figure out why our drop shadow wasn't actually being applied, because if you look at our markup, you'll see that only height, width, padding, and background color are being specified. And looking at this, I can actually quickly see that I kind of messed up on the syntax for the drop shadow. Now if you think I'm doing this because of we're doing a recording and I want to show you debugging, you're not entirely true actually. I actually hoped that all this stuff would have worked just fine out of the box, but as you know, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. And here we are making some awesome lemonade. And so I'm going to remove the commas, which is no longer needed for the drop shadow filter property. And notice once I've done that, you see the outline of our card component appearing. And just like that, first make sure it's a sanity check. Let's make sure it's the same on our in our browser, and exactly the same thing appears as well. So what we can safely say is now we're in a shape where our application works just fine, and in getting there you kind of got a quick overview of how to identify problems by using the developer tools and how easy it is to identify missing weird filter values, or in the case of React, actual errors in my JSX. So that's pretty neat. All right, so right now we have our card, and our card is getting displayed, right? So we'll leave it alone for now. And let's now fix our square component. This is the component responsible for displaying the colored region inside our card. So for this, I want to create a style object. I'm going to call this var square style. And just like before, open bracket, in bracket. And inside here, we're going to specify all the various properties that will be used for styling our content. Just like before, height, 150 pixels. Nothing too crazy here. And background color. Let's give it a background color. Background color as in camel case terminology. And we'll give it FF6663. And we have a color going here. And now we'll return a div element and make sure that this particular style is applied to it in the same way we did earlier for the card. Style equals bracket, square, style. All right, so now we have our square component. I think the alignment's off a little bit. Okay, now the alignment's fine. I'm a stickler for code formatting to make sure things are at least presented and indented properly. I'm not going to get into the spaces versus tabs debate though. I don't want to lose subscribers in having that discussion. All right, we now have our square component defined. So what we're going to do next is actually inside our card component reference square. So far what we've been seeing is that we've been always calling our components entirely from React DOM.render. But one of the nice things we talked about is that React makes composing components very easy. So what we're going to do is actually call our square component from inside the card component itself. So inside where we have our div style card style, let's go ahead and define our square component. And I really hope this just works because there you go. And it does. You now see the square component that we defined earlier is now being displayed fully through the confines of the card component. Pretty cool, right? So all we have now is just one more component left, and that is our label component. And so you know the drill by now. We're going to declare a style object. We're going to call this one var. Actually, I put in the wrong location. It needs to be inside the render function. It's not a free for all here. Var label style equals open bracket, close bracket. Let's make sure to add the semicolon. I don't want to go into React, the dev tools in Chrome one more time to fix issues. You guys probably hate me for that. Font family, sans serif. Love sans serif. Font weight, bold. We want the numbers to pop. Padding is going to be 13 pixels. And we're going to have a margin value of 0. No margin needed. All right, so now we have our label defined, and we're going to return not an empty div. We return a value p, style equals bracket label style. And just for kicks right now, we're going to hard code the value, hashtag FFF663, and close the p tag that we have going for us. All right, things look sort of good right now. Everything seems to be displayed. And now what we need to do is call the label component. And we'll call the label component also from our card. We'll have bits below where we call our square component. Let's just define our label component as well. And let's go ahead and save it. And notice that right now you see that we have our card and we have our label displayed properly just below it. This is absolutely great, right? We were able to go from having barely anything in our code to having some components that end up displaying what we set out to actually display. Now, we're not quite done yet. There's one more thing I want to talk about. I want to actually pass properties where the color of our card is something that is not hard-coded, but something that is parameterized. And how we're going to do this is by specifying the property entirely in where we define the card, or where we instantiate the card itself. So it's going to be starting all the way at the very bottom in React DOM.render. So I'm going to have card, create a prop called color. So I'm just going to define it straight up right here, and give it a value of, let's just say blue for now, just so we can be somewhat confident that everything is working just fine. So card color blue. And because we haven't mapped this prop to anything else, you won't be seeing anything actually changing. So our card now has a prop called color and a value of blue currently thrown into its little container. And what we need to do is pass that on to our square and label components. So I'm going to call square color, and I'm going to call this one this dot props dot color. Now you don't have to define the attribute at the same value. The only thing that really matters is the value of the prop as it's been passed into this component. But just to keep it consistent, I'm calling this color. You don't have to do that. So it's label color, same exact thing. This dot props dot color, because whatever color we specify, we ideally want to display in the label as well. Not only do it the background color, you need to change for that. Okay, so now we're passing in the prop from the card into our square and label components, which are both here. So now we're passing the property there. Now all that we need to do is actually change the value of the property to actually use it. So once you've made this change, let's go ahead and change the value in our return color for label. So where we have our hard-coded value, hashtag FF663, let's change it to this dot props.color. Notice it's in the curly brackets because we want to evaluate it. And once I've done that, notice that you'll see the word blue being displayed. And just like similarly, let's go ahead and change the background color for the square component. And just like before, because we're not in JSX, we're in straight up JavaScript territory, we'll just not use the angle brackets and just say this dot props dot color. And once you've done that, you'll now see our background of our element displayed in blue. So that's pretty cool, right? We define the property here and it goes all the way up there. And just to see like, something more crazy, let's change the color from blue to FFA737 and see what that looks like. It should be a nice yellowish orange color. Pretty cool. This is also the color you see throughout the slides that I've been using for the series of React videos as well. So that's pretty neat also. Now, the nice thing about all of this, right, is that what we used is something known as component composability. We created a component which in turn calls other components, and all of this is very self-contained. This is like object-oriented programming principles applied to defining the visuals of your page, which is, I think in my opinion, one of the biggest advantages React brings to the table is it makes your workflow for going from a mock-up or some visuals you want to create into something that can be meaningfully represented in code, and it can be done in a very systematic way, which I think is probably one of the best things that can happen, because all this markup you see here is very self-contained. It really has no knowledge of everything else. So for example, our square component has no clue about how it's going to be used. It doesn't know about the label, it doesn't know about any props that are going to be passed into it outside of the definition right here. Same goes for a label. But despite that, when used in the right context, for example, when used inside the card component, they can be reused and applied to solve our particular problem, which is to create a palette card. So this separation of concerns, it's the term that people use in computer science and programming to talk about this, is a good thing. And having it work in our UI land is even better. So with that, we're actually, let's go back to here. We covered a major example today. We went from creating examples with components that did very little to taking in a more realistic scenario. You have some UI you want to represent. We not only identified the various components, we talked about how you go about identifying the components, some heuristics you can use, and then we went up and actually just coded it. And we coded it quite up, and also happened to run into a few snags which we identified and fixed using the debugging features of your browser. So pretty good coverage of a lot of things, so we should be pretty proud of ourselves, or at least I'm proud of myself. And so if you have any questions, post in the forums at forum.croupa.com, where I and others will be more than happy to help you out. And tell your friends and enemies if you want them to learn all about components and how to do more realistic things with them. And hit subscribe to be notified of more videos like this and others that I periodically post to this channel. If you want more bite-sized updates on not just React topics, but just a whole slew of topics that I find interesting that I think you might also find interesting, follow me at Croupa. And if you want a more systematic approach of learning all of these React concepts, check out my book, Learning React. It's available at Amazon.com and in real-world bookstores in paperback and Kindle editions. And with that, I think we all deserve a break, so I will see you guys next time.